Welcome to the Behaviorist Book Club. We're a community of busy ABA practitioners just trying to stay in touch with the current literature in our field. You can find more at my website, www.behavioristbookclub.com, at my Twitter, at BehavioristBC, and of course my Facebook group, the Behaviorist Book Club. Let's hop right into it. This series is ABA in one take, as I think I'm going to have to be calling it. And this is the Friday of our first bonus week. We did finish volume 54, issue number 4 of JABA, all 27 articles. And we get to explore behavior analysis in practice a little bit and read some articles that caught my eye. This one is a particularly one that I'm very excited about, an evaluation of balance, a home-based parent-implemented program addressing emerging problem behavior. This was published in 2021 by Ruppel and colleagues. Notably, Dr. Hanley, Robin Landa, and Aditha Rajaman are the other authors, and it seems to come from that same Dr. Hanley group out of Western New England University. So, like I said, this is something I'm very excited about. I've heard the Balance program chatted about on Facebook groups that I'm a part of, but I have never heard of it described or published about in this way. It does come with Dr. Hanley as a second author, so I'm assuming that it will have a heavy focus on social validity and on slow but consistent behavior change. And I hate to toot my own horn, but when I wrote that note on the article, I was correct because there is a heavy focus on social validity. Now, this isn't a typical, I guess you would say typical ABA article, in that it really flips the script. ABA is a very reactive science and treatment method, primarily due to factors beyond practitioners' controls, such as insurance companies. We don't get to be a preventative field right now. We're only reactive. We are the people who come in after problem behavior or skill deficits have already occurred, and it's up to us to play catch up and get the child back to where their peers are. This is contrary to a lot of preventative medicines that have much more success on a much wider scale. These are things like a doctor promoting healthy eating to everyone, generally, to reduce obesity in America. That's a preventative strategy. Now, healthy eating can be a reactive strategy. I think you would probably term this a diet. If you are obese and the doctor tells you that you have to do the keto or whatever diet of the month is popular at the time. But it also is a preventative strategy in that everybody who generally eats healthy can most likely avoid obesity. So in that way, ABA has always been reactive, and it's always been one of my struggles with the field. This concept was first introduced to me by Dr. Iwata in an undergraduate class, Brian Iwata, and it was really fascinating to hear him talk about how he personally struggled with this fact a lot. He developed the functional analysis, but it was always a reactive tool. It wasn't a preventative tool that needed to be utilized across children, across school districts, across whole counties worth of individuals. It was always this reactive strategy that was applied precisely when needed. So there have been other researchers who have tried to get at this problem for a while, and it seems like the Balance program is just one answer to that. The Balance program is loosely based on the Preschool Life Skills Program. Now, we did talk about the Preschool Life Skills Program in a previous article. I'm trying to find it. Give me 1 second. Yes, we talked about McCowan et al. In 2021. That's volume 54, issue number 4. They talked about early friendship skills, specifically in the Preschool Life Skills Program, but we generally talked about it in that article if you want to check out that episode. But it was first developed by Hanley and colleagues in 2007 and was focused on teaching these preventative programs for typically developing kids specifically in preschool classrooms, hence the name. But the research has all been done with typically developing kids and not developmental disabilities. So this, one of the purposes of this article was to extend the Preschool Life Skills Program to developmentally disabled population. In addition, they wanted to improve on the Preschool Life Skills Program by adding a couple different components. The first component was a synthesized reinforcement concept to the program, or a child-led time to the program. So this looked like whatever reinforcers the child valued, that was their child-led time. This is where presumably the probability of problem behavior occurring was 0, because the child had access to all different items that they found reinforcing. This access to child-led time, once acquired and shown to be experimentally manipulated and consistent, could then be given contingent on demonstrated skills. So that was kind of like a built-in naturalistic reinforcer. The second component was balancing child and adult-led activities. Now, they got this concept from parent-child interaction therapy. So a child-led activity may be playing with dolls on a skateboard, while climbing their toy mountain. Very imaginative. The child's doing whatever they want. Now, that differs from adult-led activities in which the adult is leading the activity. It doesn't have to be realistic what the adult's doing. They can also be taking the dolls up the trampoline or doing whatever, but it's something that the adult chooses, not the child. So that's where they got the name balance, because they're trying to balance child and adult-led activities. So all of that melds together into the purpose of this article, which is modifying the Preschool Life Skills Program and changing the name to a much more catchy balance program to include the above components and evaluating the effects of this newly termed balance program with parents as the primary interventionist on children with developmental disabilities. All of the children had ASD, and they were 4 young, around age 4 kids, and their caregivers. They focused on they selected in only participants who had socially mediated emerging problem behaviors. I think the fact that they specifically looked at socially mediated problem behaviors, I think out of the blue presents potentially a limitation and a boundary condition for this balance program, but I do see why they chose to make that decision, and I think they explain it a little more further down the article as well. Each BCBA spent 2 hours per week with the child and the caregiver. They based this off of standard recommendations for BCBA to child and parent training time, and there was no clear amount of time that they told the parents to interact with their child, only to continue to practice the skills. They also, in order to reduce response effort from the parents, no data were taken, and this makes sense, but it kind of sucks, because I wish we could have that data. Experimentally, I wish we could see the data, the number of trials, all those different values, but overall, looking at this from a socially meaningful point of view, it doesn't diminish the data too much. It does reduce my believability a little bit as a cynical scientist, but I get why they did it, and I think I would make that same choice as well. But I still want the data, as I do. The the dependent variables was the completion of the target responses and completion of the child objectives. So the teaching process was broken up into 10 different steps. And I am going to actually go over each step, because I think when you walk through the steps, it presents a really clear picture of what their goal was for each one. So the first was to present no establishing operations for emerging problem behavior, and the child objective was to play with the absence of emergent problem behavior. They were trying to establish the quote HRE, the happy, relaxed, engaged, and they were trying to get in a situation where the probability of problem behavior for that child was 0. The next objective for the parent was to shape responding to the name. For the child, they wanted the child to be able to stop, look, and say yes to a name call. The next, step 3, was shaping functional communication, and the child was supposed to admit part of the request. Next, step 4, the parent had to teach the complete request, and the child admitted the complete request. Then the parent shaped tolerance, and the child responds to denials calmly. Next, for shape 6, the parent had to shape cooperation, and the child had to follow 1 to 3 instructions from the parent. Then the post-test was to shape persistence, and the child had to complete all steps of an activity. I believe the activity was chosen by a parent. And then 8, 9, and 10 were all generality steps. So first the child had to complete new activities, then demonstrate all skills without the predetermined experimental bins and materials. And then finally, the last step was to demonstrate all the skills and typical routines around the house. So you can see here how they go to establish HRE in their control. Then they do responding to name. After responding to name, they look at functional communication. Then they shape tolerance and cooperation. So as you see that kind of flow through, you actually get a really good look at what a strong early intervention program looks like. I think there are some things that could have been added. Obviously, if this was like a child who was coming 40 hours a week to the clinic, but the goal here wasn't to teach a child 300 different tasks. The goal was to treat emerging problem behavior and evaluate a program that can be applied statewide. Evaluate something that can be applied across the district, taught at hospitals, something that's being applied to every single kid. And not every single kid with autism is going to need to learn 300 tasks, which I think was the reason why they didn't include some of those specific steps. Like I said, the dependent variables were the completion of those steps, so it obviously did vary. The experimental design was a non-concurrent multiple baseline. This is the same thing that I'm going to say about other non-concurrent multiple baselines. It's not exactly a extremely rigorous experimental design, but it is extremely practical. And I totally understand why these experimenters used this design. It would have been ridiculous to keep these children in baseline for an extended period of time just to wait for experimental control. With the non-concurrent multiple baseline, you had much more flexibility. It's much easier to do controlled consecutive case series if that's what they were aiming at in the first place. And it generally is much more clinically friendly and appropriate. I think that maybe they could have made this a little stronger by adding some embedded reversals because there is a little bit of weakness in the non-concurrent multiple baseline design. But regardless, I still think there's believable data to be seen here. I think there's still value to what we're looking at. The conditions was first a natural baseline, which was totally parent-directed. The BCBA had no say in the matter. The next was a prompted baseline, in which the BCBA had the parent prompt about half of the time. And next was the teaching steps 1 through 10. There were 2 different teaching procedures that were offered to the parents. Remember, this is a study that's focusing on social validity, and I love the fact that they offered options to the parents about the prompting procedures that were going to be ever present in their lives throughout this program. The first one was 3-step prompting, going from least to most. It's unclear if there was escape extinction involved. They did mention that there was a physical prompt to end the 3-step prompt, so it was verbal, gestural, full physical. However, it's unclear if they followed through with the full physical or not. Knowing some of Dr. Hanley and his group's previous work, I would assume that there wasn't any escape extinction involved, but it's kind of unclear from the article, so something to think about. The next teaching option was wait it out, where they would remove the tangible or attention until a direction is followed. This was selected by 1 out of the 4 kids, and 3-step prompting was selected by 3 out of the 4 kids, the caregivers of these children. The post-test was test 7, and generality was steps 8, 9, and 10. There were modifications needed in 2 cases. Max needed additional in-clinic practice with the BCBA, and additional modeling by the BCBA after the follow-up. Kelly needed also more BCBA practice, and they also did not include response to name and tolerance response trials in her program because she wasn't moving as efficiently as the other children, and the parents wanted to keep the progress going. The results were generally pretty strong. In their graphs, child-directed play went down and teaching trials went up, so adult-directed did go up. Emerging problem behavior stayed low throughout, even on the follow-up and generality tests. Follow-ups were generally strong. Their social skills and cooperation saw a little bit of regression. I don't think this surprises anybody, the fact that, 3 to 4 weeks after intervention, social skills were a little iffy. I think this notes that there is a little bit less environmental reinforcement for these behaviors. Maybe the children don't have as much chances to practice these skills with other peers. It also may be the case that the child doesn't get naturally reinforced for exhibiting these behaviors and peers their own age. It could be either of those two, but regardless, it's not uncommon to see the follow-up social skills and cooperation dropping. I'm not surprised by that at all. For the time requirements, 15 sessions were needed for Walt, so that was 15 weeks. 20 weeks for Jaden, and then here's the kicker, 59 for Max and 56 for Kelly. These were the kids where modifications were needed. So it makes sense that they took a little bit more time. In fact, I think a lot more time. I know that because they were doing clinic sessions with the BCBA, it didn't actually take 60 weeks to wrap up the treatment phase with them, but it did take a decent amount of time. Strong social validity, as expected. I didn't think anything was abnormal about that. I think that they did a lot to focus on the needs of the consumer, and I think it showed with the strong social validity reports. Now, as this is really the first article looking at this new treatment procedure for every child out there's a lot of areas for improvements, which is to be expected. The fact that 50% of the children needed modifications indicates that there are some areas that need to be more efficient. It also may suggest some boundaries for treatment, specifically prerequisite language skills. They noted that for the child who they had to remove tolerance responses and FCR, they noted that child had the least amount of functional verbal skills coming into the intervention. So it may be that certain functioning verbal skills are necessary to complete the balanced program efficiently. And this kind of relates back to special education tiers, and they point this out. Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 refer to tiers of intervention. Tier 1 is general. Everyone gets this type of intervention. Think the tickets that get handed out for good behavior in school. This is where the balanced program is supposed to sit. This isn't a specific Tier 3 intervention that is specialized like a behavior intervention plan or an IEP. That maybe have been the case for Max and Kelly, who needed the modifications. Let me just check. Yeah, Max and Kelly needed the modifications, but it's not really built for those kids. It's built to be the Tier 1 general option. So overall, my key takeaways from this article is I'm pretty happy with it. I think that the fact that they were able to build this generalized intervention, I think is really cool, and it's a step in the right direction. I think for my second one is that we need to continue to be cynical and skeptical as more research will invariably get published about this topic. I'm really excited to see that new research come out because I have a feeling that it's going to make me more and more confident about this research procedure. But with only one published intervention, I don't want to get too excited about it, as I think there is still some questions that need to be answered. I think there was a little bit of vagueness in the teaching procedures used. Generally, 3-step prompting, words like shaping were thrown around, but there wasn't a lot of specifics about how it was specifically shaped or what the parent training looked like. So I think that's something to look for in future publications. Finally, for my consideration as you are driving to work or driving to a client's house or whatever you may be doing this fine Friday, I think that for me, the focus on preventative ABA is really cool. And it suggests an important shift in our field, a shift from the reactive to the preventative. And I'd like you to consider what are some of the things that you do every day that serve as reactive, such as conducting an emergency functional analysis because a new topography of behavior just popped up, and maybe we can shift that to be preventative. So maybe instead of observing the new topography of behavior 3 weeks into treatment, we do better parent interviews or better observations, or, even different treatment interventions so that we don't see emergent topographies of problem behavior. So think about the things you do and see in what way they can be more efficient and in what way they can be more preventative. That's all I got for this week, everyone. Thank you for another fun week. I hope you enjoyed our random article week, as well as the first edition of One Less Lonely Practitioner. I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope to make more in the future. Thank you so much for listening, everyone, and I hope you all have a great weekend.